So we're here at Toronto ComiCon with comic legend Jim Shooter. It's great to be here with you, sir. Of course, you're here for the special Secret Wars panel that happened just yesterday. You and Mike Zeck are here, and John Beatty. Is it great to look back on this basically iconic series, you know, that kind of started the ball rolling on event books, and see that it still has, you know, a number of fans and even new fans every year?
I think it's great. I mean, we couldn't predict that. But 30 years later, people are still talking about it, bringing the book to have it signed by Mike and John and myself, and still interested, and that's great. And you're right, it was the first sort of giant mega crossover, and after we did that at Marvel, then pretty much every company every year, every summer was doing the crossover because it sold so well, and it was such a good idea to get a lot of characters together in one big story.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because you mentioned that everybody started doing it. Now it seems like in this day and age, companies like Marvel and DC are even sometimes doing it quarterly, like every few months.
Yeah, that's one of the troubles with the comic book business is they come up with a trick and they run it into the ground, you know.
Yeah.
Well, I did a bunch of crossovers. I did Secret Wars at Marvel. Then we did the sequel, Secret Wars 2. And every time I did it, I tried to do it differently. The first one, actually, it was 12 issues, but all 12 issues happened between the December books and the January books.
Yeah.
Okay. And so therefore, although Mike designed the black costume months before, and it actually appeared, I think, in Spider-Man number 362, something like that, which came out in January, and it didn't show up in Secret Wars until July or August.
Yeah.
I mean, but all that stuff we did it in advance so that we could have the January books reflect what had happened during Secret Wars. So that was one way to do it. The second way, I did it concurrently with the comics in continuity.
Right.
And I had the story in Secret Wars sort of branch into those other comics. In other words, if Power Man appeared in, as I think he did in the first issue, there was part of the story that continued into that month's issue of Power Man.
Right.
And we tried to do it well. We tried not to burden the reader with continuity, so if you hadn't read Secret Wars, you could still read Power Man. And it makes sense. You know, you'd get enough information so you could make sense of it. But we wanted to make the story bigger that way.
Yeah.
And that worked out very well. So that's the second way we did it. And then when I did it at my next company, which was Valiant, there was no special miniseries. The crossover took place in the regular issues.
Right.
You know, with a special issue on either end. So I mean, I kept trying to do it differently, but I think a lot of people just take the easy way out. They just like throw a bunch of characters in a story. It's not really in continuity. That's too much work. Seriously, it was too much. I mean, I think I'm the only one crazy enough to actually do the work and figure it out and make sure everything is in continuity and stuff. Of course, I had a lot of help.
Yeah.
But I mean, like to do it right, it's hard. And a lot of people just like, all right, it kind of doesn't count. It's off to the side. Just a lot of characters, you know.
Right.
But it could still be good. You just have to bring something new to it.
Of course. Now it's interesting. You bring up continuity. Continuity is something that's kind of been debated over the past few years. Of like, there's some fans that feel that there's not really a level of relevance anymore to keep that tight a continuity, and that people should just be able to tell stories and then let the readers decide how they connect together. Whereas others are very adamant about everything has to have a connection and a piece. What are your thoughts on that?
I think common sense applies. I think that the old way, the DC Comics way, if you had 100 Superman stories, you could publish them in any order. It didn't matter, you know. And it was only in sort of the late 70s, early 80s that they actually started trying to do continuity at DC. But their continuity was a problem for them because they had all this history that had no continuity, and then trying to insert continuity, bolted on, it just wasn't working too well. And so they've gone through crisis after crisis to try to straighten that out, and it just gets more tangled up. And I think that Marvel also, I think that while I was there, it was a long time ago, and while Stan was there, it was a little easier to try to coordinate among the editors and make sure that Dr. Doom, wasn't destroying Hershey, Pennsylvania because he hates chocolate. At the same time, he was conquering Switzerland because he loves chocolate,
Yeah.
And it was a lot of work, but we made a real effort to try to keep things coordinated. Now I think it's kind of gotten out of hand, like it did at DC. There's multiple iterations of characters like Spider-Man. There's so many timelines running at once right now. It's really hard to keep track of. So my answer is, I'm not saying everybody should do lockstep continuity like I did at Valiant, where I had everything with a time and a date, and if something happened in Solar at a certain time and a certain date, and it was a big event, the kids in Harbinger read about it in the paper the next day.
Right.
But I'm not saying you could do that. That's fine. I think we did a good job with that. But I think it comes down to common sense. Just Mark Twain once said, "Do not play crass stupidities upon the reader," and I think that's it. If you just do it, if you just don't care, and it's just so haphazard that it doesn't make any sense at all.
Right.
But if you make a reasonable effort to try to make it consistent.
Back when you were the editor, and we had the Dark Phoenix Saga, and of course there was the comments of like, well, there has to be a moral, punishment for what had happened, sort of thing. Not necessarily punishment, but the person couldn't go without having, there had to be, some moral, it had to be morally correct.
I wouldn't use the word moral.
Okay, not moral?
No, not at all. I mean, that's how the story gets told by a lot of people. But basically, Chris Claremont and John Byrne did a brilliant story, and it started off to be a story where Jean Grey was actually going to become and permanently remain a supervillain. She was going to become the Doctor Doom for the X-Men.
Right.
Because I told Chris needed an idea once, and I said, well, we've had a lot of Marvel bad guys who have become good guys, like Hawkeye and the Black Widow. We've never had a good guy become a bad guy, And he said, don't say anything else, because Chris didn't want. He wanted to do it all by himself, right?
Yeah.
So then he started on this brilliant storyline, and Phoenix becomes the Dark Phoenix, and it's getting pretty intense, right?
Yeah.
And then at the end, he chickened out. When I read the plot for the last issue, he just couldn't pull the trigger, And so what he did was he had her brain all fixed by the alien technology,
right.
And then she just goes back to Long Island and everything's normal. In other words, it's a circular story. Nothing happened.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, yeah, and she did blow up a planet full of people and destroy a starship, but she's okay now. It's like, let's take the German army away from Hitler and then let them live on Long Island. But to me, I said the main thing to me was like that is just not a good ending. That's not an adequate ending for the story. I mean, I want an ending. This is copping out. And so at first he said, well, like what? And I said, well, maybe they put her in galactic prison or something. And he says, no, that wouldn't be any good, because then the X-Men would always be trying to rescue her or whatever.
Right.
I said, I'm not sure about that, but okay. I said, then you come up with something. And then Chris came in the next morning and he said, I'm going to kill her. And I said, really? Okay, deal. She's dead. He said, what do you mean she's dead? And I said, you just said you're going to kill her. He said, you can't kill her. And I said, no, you said you're going to kill her. So we have this stupid argument. And then he runs out of my office. 10 seconds later, John Byrne calls me from Canada, from Calgary. And his first words were, are you out of your mind? And I said, no, we're killing her. That's it, And I mean, like, if you want to talk about moral issues, yeah, well, it is nice that it's somebody who destroyed an entire 3 billion people and a starship and all that. I guess there's some moral justice to the fact that she died, but that wasn't the point. The point was it's a better story. And the way Chris always tells it is, I made him kill Phoenix until he was interviewed on camera recently, and Louise Jones happened to be Louise Simonson. She was Jones at the time. Simonson happened to be sitting next to him while he was being interviewed, and she when he said that, she turned to him and she said, Chris, it was you, it was your idea. And he said, well, yeah.
Okay, well, there you go.
So vindication. It's great.